Today we are going to start studying the animal kingdom. As you know, I'm not going to be here this week with you, but we're going to keep the lessons as close to what they would normally be as we can. So today we're going to go through the notes. I'm going to go through and talk about the slides just like I normally do, and you are going to fill in the notes in the packet that I gave you last week. If you don't have a packet, if you didn't get one or you've lost it, there are more packets up front that you can grab. And so just to give you an idea of what the week will look like, each day we will go through 4 different sections of notes from the packet that you have. There are 4 parts. This is typical of what we do in class. We'll go over a section of the notes, and then after that you'll have a practice activity to do that relates to that section of notes. Today we are going to be talking about the characteristics of animals, and as we go through this first chapter of animals, we're basically doing an overview of what makes an animal, what the different phyla of animals are, how animals grow and reproduce and develop. And then after this chapter, we will start with the simplest animal, which is sponges, and move through each of the 9 major phyla, ending with mammals at the end of the semester. So just to review, if you look at the diagram here, you can see that we have already studied 4 of these kingdoms, Archaebacteria and Eubacteria. We talked about protists like the amoeba and the paramecium, and then the last chapter was about fungi. Now, we are not going to have a complete chapter about plants. We could have a whole course on plants. We are going to skip that one and move straight on into animals for the rest of the semester. So as I go through these notes, you will copy the notes that are in red. They will correspond with the blanks on your paper. I ask that you either turn on the subtitles if possible, or put your headphones in so that you are listening and people at other places in the room at other points in their notes are not able to hear you. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do, and this is something that we would do in class if I were with you, and that is think about what image comes to mind when you hear the word animal. And so if we were to fill in this concept map, think about what you think people would say an animal is. What animal do they think of? And I think what we would see is that most people would say dogs, cats, bears, maybe even fish, reptiles like an alligator. But most people probably don't think of simpler animals like jellyfish or sponges when they hear the word animal. But those are in fact animals. I think what we are used to are thinking of animals as more vertebrates, but there are actually more invertebrates in the world, and then there are vertebrates. So let's jump into the notes here. And like I said, this first section is going to be about animal characteristics. What makes an animal an animal? So we are going to talk about invertebrates and vertebrates, like I mentioned before, the general features that all animals share. In other words, what makes an animal an animal. We're going to talk about some important words that we'll go back to for the rest of the semester as we study the 9 major phyla. These are also vocabulary words like symmetry and segmentation. And these are all things that will determine how complex an animal is. And we're also going to talk today about directional terms like anterior, posterior, and you may know these words if you've already taken anatomy or Mr. Himes' class or Miss Scipio's class. Okay, so like I mentioned before, if I asked you which of these is an animal, you would probably be pretty certain the dog is an animal and maybe the frog. But a lot of times students don't realize that arthropods like these mealworms and the spider, even though they are invertebrates, they don't have a backbone, they are animals. And the reason they qualify as animals is because they meet these 4 characteristics. Okay, so you can write what's in red. Okay, so remember Let's just review what these words mean. Heterotrophic means that animals can't make their own food like plants do. Okay, we have to eat other things. Animals have unique ways of catching their food, and we'll talk about that. All animals are eukaryotic, meaning they have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. All animals are multicellular, and this is why animal like protists, like the amoeba that do move around and catch their food, they can't make it. They do not belong in the animal kingdom because they are unicellular, and all animals are multicellular. Animals also do not have cell walls. So when we say lack cell walls, that means they do not have cell walls. There are more than 30 recognized phyla of animals. Remember, phyla is the taxa below kingdom. And we're going to study the 9 major phyla. 95% of those phyla, though, are invertebrates. Okay, they do not have a backbone. So things like sponges, cnidarians, arthropods, mollusks are invertebrates. Vertebrates, which we normally think of as animals, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Vertebrates only make up 5%. Okay? So let's talk about an animal's multicellularity. Because an animal is multicellular, they have specialized cells. So whereas an amoeba, I mentioned before, that one cell has to do everything for the life functions of that amoeba. They have to catch the food, digest the food, get rid of the waste, reproduce. Animals are more efficient because they have specialized cells. Now, there's always going to be exceptions to this. Sponges are an exception. They do not have tissues. And so a sponge is going to be an exception, like I said, to a lot of what we talk about. But all other animals have specialized cells, and those cells are grouped into tissues, and those tissues make up the organs of the organism, and then the organs make up an organ system. Okay, so that the fact that an animal is multicellular and has specialized cells makes it possible to have the variety of the animal kingdom I mentioned before. So lots of different types of animals. Here's a diagram that explains that in a different way. There's nothing to write here, but just remember, a cell is the smallest unit of life. It's one of the characteristics of living things that defines living things. They're made of cells. Cells are grouped into tissues. So tissues are a group of cells working together. And then you have different tissues that can make up an organ. And then different organs make up an organ system. So that you have different organs in the digestive system. And then the organ systems like digestive system, respiratory system, reproductive system, they make up the organism. And so we will talk about those systems more this week as well. Okay, animals also have different body plans depending on their complexity. We call that body symmetry. The symmetry of an organism is how its parts are arranged. You may be familiar with the word symmetry from geometry. And symmetry is determined in the animal kingdom basically by whether you can divide the organism into halves or not. So the sponge here you see is asymmetrical. There's no way you can draw a line and divide that sponge into equal halves. But the anemone here, there are multiple ways you can draw a line and divide it in half. It's kind of like a pizza, okay? There are lots of ways you can cut it in half, and that makes it radial, okay? It's round like a pizza. So things like starfish, the hydra, which is like a freshwater anemone, and the jellyfish all have radial symmetry. Animals that have bilateral symmetry have a right and a left side. So you can draw a line and divide it into right and left halves. So humans, insects, cats have bilateral symmetry. So let's look at some organisms and see what kind of symmetry they have. Up here in the right hand corner, this is a sponge. There's no way you can draw a line and divide it into right and left halves, so it's asymmetrical. That A means not or without, so it is asymmetrical, no symmetry. These bottom two are anemones, and so you can particularly see on this blue anemone, there's different ways you can go across horizontally, down vertically, diagonally, and you're dividing that into right and left halves, kind of like a pizza. Now keep in mind the way you look at the organism is going to have an effect on how you determine the symmetry. So this anemone on the left is a different view, but you can still see looking down from the top that it's going to have radial symmetry. So kind of think about the different angles, and don't just go by how the picture looks, okay? You can kind of see that above too here in the sea slug. Even though you're not looking at it from the top, you can see it has two antennae, and you can draw a line down the middle and divide it into right and left halves. And here the primate that you're looking at from the front, it's easy to see that you can draw one line down and you have an eye on each side, an ear on each side. If you could see the whole body, you would see an arm on each side, a leg on each side. And so both of these at the top here have bilateral symmetry. Another thing that can help you determine bilateral symmetry is organisms that are bilateral have a head end. So anything with a head is going to be bilateral. Okay, it has a right half, a left half, and a head end. So the sponge and the anemones do not have heads, and so they do not have bilateral symmetry. Also keep in mind, sometimes an organism with bilateral symmetry is not going to be perfectly symmetrical. So you may have something like a fiddler crab where the males have a larger claw on one side. They still have a head, so they still have bilateral symmetry, even though they're not perfectly symmetrical. Okay, another example would be a starfish who's lost one of its legs. Okay, so just kind of think about the typical starfish or the typical crab to determine what type of symmetry it has. And that's what you're going to do for practice today, is work with symmetry. Another important word is cephalization. You may recognize the prefix ceph, meaning head. Okay, so cephalization is an anterior concentration of sense organs. In other words, these organisms have a brain, and generally the more complex an organism is, the more pronounced their cephalization, or the bigger their brain is going to be. So an octopus is a mollusk. Mollusks have a head with brains, generally. But of all the mollusks, the cephalopods like the octopus are going to be the most intelligent. They can figure out how to open jars and get treats out. The octopus are very interesting if you've never watched videos on those. But they are in the class Cephalopoda because that means head, foot. So again, cephalization means an organism has a head. And in fact, some animals do not have heads or brains, like the ones that have no symmetry or radial symmetry. Another important term that we'll use throughout the rest of the semester is segmentation. And it is just what it sounds like, having segments. More advanced animals have segments. So you can see on this earthworm, it has ridges. Those are segments. If we dissected this earthworm and cut it open, you would see that it also has segments on the inside. The ribs and the vertebrae of a human are repeating segments. More complex organisms, more complex animals have segmentation. And then last, we're going to refer back to these terms: anterior, which means towards the head; posterior, which means towards the tail; and dorsal and ventral. Dorsal is the back side, ventral is the belly side. The famous dorsal fin of a shark is seen here. And the way you can remember dorsal and ventral, the dorsal is generally darker. Dorsal starts with a D, darker starts with a D. And that's called counter shading. So let's say this lizard is in a tree, an organism looking down on it. The lizard's dark dorsal side would blend in with the dark floor of the forest. And if an organism, a predator, were looking up at it, the light belly would blend in with the light sky. Okay, that's all the notes for today. So you can make sure you have section 1, part 1 filled in, and you are going to, at this time, go and complete the activity on what we just talked about as far as symmetry. And then you can also work on your vocabulary booklet. Part 1 is due on Wednesday, and I will see you tomorrow.